Right about the time I dropped a piano bench on Beto, the sentient soy pod in question parted his peculiar arching upper lip, and in response to a gun-toting soccer mom at one of his town halls, offered the following fucking stupidity.
I was one of the gun-owning Americans that heard your speech and heard what you had to say regarding hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s and your AR and your
Let's be respectful. Let's be respectful.
Well, I am here to say hell no, you're not. All you're going to do is restrict law-abiding citizens like myself. We all know that you, sir, have a criminal history, and I understand that burglars do not like armed defense.
It's okay.
Yes, sir. Burglars do not like armed defense, yet that is a right that we have that shall not be infringed in America.
There's this presumption that we are just, I guess, inherently evil. Because you ask, how are we going to legislate this? And the 40,000 gun deaths in America, there just must be something wrong with us. Or gets back to this idea that I began my comments with, is this just our fate? I refuse to accept that. This doesn't happen in any other country.
The best argument, or one of the best arguments I think I've heard, is that the Second Amendment is intended to ensure that the American public, if they need to, can provide a violent check on their government, a tyrannical administration. People can rise up militarily against their government. We hear about a well-regulated militia. In my reading of U.S. history, we settled this question about whether we should be able to rise up against our government in 1865 in a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. I want to make sure that we protect your right to use a firearm to hunt or to defend yourself in your home. But if it is a right to be able to rise up or stand against your government, I don't accept that. That's not my reading of it.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
As excellent gun rights-related YouTuber Colion Noir pointed out, not only is the Second Amendment enshrined in the Constitution, it tellingly is one of the only amendments that explains precisely why it exists.
I'm reading a book called Trail of Tears about the history of the Cherokee Nation. And the book starts out in the late 18th century, and there are these militias that are responding to attacks by Cherokees and Creeks, and there are these militias who themselves are going on the offense and attacking Native American communities. It is incredibly bloody, but that is a militia at that time defending or going on the offense for a given community.
And guess who had the guns in that situation? The government. The same government that to the Native Americans was being tyrannical. Robert, you're literally making the case for why we need these guns and why the Native Americans needed those guns.
Beto's counter-arguments are boilerplate and puerile, but as someone who likes to read rebuttals to my own beliefs on occasion, if only to sharpen my own arguments, I also notice they're largely regurgitated from the Armed with Reason blog run by Devin Hughes, a terminal academic who repeatedly boasts that he graduated summa cum laude. Congrats, fucksticks, so did my mom, and she teaches kindergarten. Even a cursory glance at his website confirms he has a bit of a bugaboo with the very idea of militias, particularly those devoted to countering the ascendance of tyranny. And I quote, "Democratic government is derived from the people. A tyrannical government could only arise in the U.S. with the majority of the population supporting it due to some economic or military crisis." I should note this article was written in 2013, the height of the recession. Even moldering for a half-century, fucking Freud could spot this cat projecting contemporary mores on a law drafted in the 18th fucking century from space. But I digress. Quote, "In reaction, say, to a heavily armed minority attempting to enforce its will on the rest of the country," unquote. This minority, he argues, is a militia. It gets better when he quotes the Second Amendment, believe it or not. Quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," which he punctuates with the following statement. "The Founding Fathers were wrong." Welp, at least for once, a gun control advocate's familiar enough with the concept of a subordinate clause that he isn't contesting the meaning of the amendment itself to mean the militia has sole access to said firearms. Progress in small doses, Padawan. What, pray tell, does he define as a fucking militia? Oh, here's where the Marxist mire gets mighty thick, folks. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Ku Klux Klan. I can't even say it without laughing, but I hope you already recognize where the operative fallacy fucking resides here. All of these organizations are unregulated, and all of them disprove Beto's accompanying argument that no militia force could conceivably upend the U.S. military might.
Right now, if you wanted to arm yourself sufficient to take on a government that spends $750 billion a year on its military, which is larger than the 10 largest military budgets combined that follow ours, we're going to need more than an AR-15. We're going to need some aircraft carriers, some nuclear submarines.
News to me, last I heard, a handful of sunburned bearded fucks with goat shit on their schlongs, a couple RPGs, and an AK apiece were prolonging the Afghanistan conflict quite fucking comfortably, thank you. And this is one of the more informed anti-militia arguments. But as for Beto, motherfucker's making campaign stops in Waco and doesn't understand the necessity of a fucking militia? You want to talk tyranny? You want to know precisely how necessary a militia actually is and how close we've arced toward tyranny in just the last 30 years? Let's bring it closer to my home base, because the most prominent case of a militia coming into conflict with the U.S. government, at least in the modern era, happened right in my backyard, Arizona, 1995, the Viper fucking militia.
The government says it was a terrorist attack waiting to happen. Today, federal investigators in Phoenix arrested 12 members of a group that calls itself the Viper Militia. The investigators say the militia had spent the past 2 years planning and preparing to blow up several buildings in the Phoenix area. They were indicted under a specially designed law.
It was bloody, baby-killing headlines in the mid-90s, but most of you may never even have heard of it, either because you don't live here or because you've yet to be butt-fucking born. Those of you who have probably know the build-up better than the conclusion, how some hairy-ass motherfuckers in the Arizona desert dared challenge the sovereignty of the federal government and were arrested expediently. What you likely haven't heard is how it all ended, because the media simply stopped covering it, and with good goddamn reason, as you're about to see. Long story short, Waco wasn't the only incursion upon personal liberty imposed by the sensational she-bulk Janet Reno. For 3 years fucking later, a so-called Viper militia was apprehended in the deserts north of Phoenix after Boy Scouts reported they were blowing things up in the Tonto National Forest and even leaving smoldering craters in their wake. Soon an informant came forward who ultimately offered to work with the ATF to infiltrate the militia, covertly recording any and all evidence of terroristic intent. Hundreds of assault rifles on site, the reports crowed. Terrorist actions had been planned, they alleged. The first sign the gambit was a goddamn goat fuck came almost immediately when the militia members were arrested and arraigned, and suddenly no such terrorism charges were actually fucking filed, instead settling for minor firearms offensives. That's right, folks. Months upon months of the media breathlessly reporting plots to explode every local landmark, from the Phoenix Capitol building to the Phoenix Police Department, and not one charge of planning an actual attack accompanied the arrests. Oops! The second sign Reno had horse shit under her fucking fingernails came when the militia members' subsequent bail hearings, which in the case of genuine terrorism normally take half a fucking microsecond, dragged on instead for days. When you dig into the content of the hearings, it's immediately apparent why that is. Jose Wall, the BATF agent who helmed the case, conveniently skipped the proceeding entirely, and in his stead appeared his boss, Stephen Ott, who, when asked by the militia's defense attorneys, quote, "Isn't it a fact that the entire bomb plot wasn't true," unquote, admitted in the affirmative, quote, "Yes, that's correct," unquote. Unsurprisingly, 6 of the defendants were released without bail. Keep in mind, Janet Reno stated publicly the Fed has no choice but to act sooner rather than later to avoid an imminent attack. And here they were, released under their own recognizance, the central fucking charges dropped. Not that it helped them much. The murder mongers in media had by then made him out to be the second coming of Timothy McVeigh or a union of Unabombers.
Federal agents raided the homes of militia members and made the arrests. The indictment says they had trained with automatic weapons and engaged in field exercises in which they made and detonated rockets and ammonia nitrate bombs. It was an ammonia nitrate bomb that blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City.
And 2 of the 6 were immediately fired from their jobs and turned themselves into prison just to have a roof over their fucking heads. Classy! And it gets worse. The alleged explosives seized from the Viper militia, initially reported as nitromethane, the same compound used in the Oklahoma City bombing, if I'm not mistaken, and later lead azide, soon morphed into lead styphnate, a lesser explosive, and finally to the significantly less powerful lead picrate. The quantity of explosives was then magically reduced to just 15 gallons of the perfectly legal nitromethane. And they weren't even half done with the damn revisions. The hundreds of assault rifles reported to reside in their anarchist arsenal became 90. 90 became 77. 77 became 50, the number the ATF website still falsely reports they seized, by the by. And finally, court documents would ultimately confirm the Viper militia possessed just 4 fucking rifles, most of which were World War I and II surplus, bolt action only. Fucking oof. Then the intent to attack argument imploded when the ATF official admitted on the stand that no targets were ever selected or indeed were ever going to be until, and I quote, a new world order seizes power in America. If they'd known in advance the depths to which Janet Reno would sink to send law-abiding citizens to prison, I have to believe they may have re-examined whether or not a new order already had. Worse still, as cover, ATF agents had worked at Shooter's World throughout the investigation, a gun store here in Arizona, and actually a range that I've visited for fucking target practice on numerous occasions. And not only were assault rifles not appearing in the hands of militia, they were disappearing from the inventory at Shooter's World right before the agents started to work there. 369 weapons missing of the recorded 5,000 transactions the employees processed, suggesting the agents being employed at all was in fact quid pro quo to having Shooter's World's firearms license renewed, despite likely selling black market weapons on the side. That's right, folks. Government agents helped gank more rifles than the Viper militia ever owned, by a factor of at least 92. It gets worse still. The desert explosions and craters purported to have been created by the Vipers were later revealed to have been the work of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, who'd stumbled across explosive material in the desert and decided to detonate it rather than allow it to fall into the nefarious fucking coils of criminals, meaning the entire impetus for the arrest and apprehension of the Viper militia was rooted in an officially recorded and recognized fucking lie. Either the ATF didn't check with local agencies before drafting the original affidavit, or they knowingly covered it up Clinton style. Incompetence or corruption, take your pick, they're both pretty but fucking bad. The sentence for these 12 patriots the Clinton cabinet called domestic terrorists ranged from just 1 year to a single fucking day, with some even skating with a fucking fine. And what they were convicted of was very likely incited by the undercover ATF agents themselves, with recorded surveillance presented by the defense confirming the informants encouraged the Viper militia to include Aryan Brotherhood and other anti-Semitic material among their membership literature and symbology, and at one point even recommending they knock over a fucking bank, both of which the militia thankfully voted down, by the by. While some of this dog and phone show was initiated to cultivate positive press after Arizona's local attorney general and eventual goddamn governor, the Clinton-appointed Reno lookalike Janet Napolitano, famously refused to convict proven pedophiles in a law enforcement sting even when they were apprehended with videotapes and photographs of children being savaged by adults after the drafting of over 100 federal warrants because it, quote, unfairly targeted homosexual men, which I suppose would hit hard for Janet Napolitano given that she is a homosexual man. Objectivity.
This case represents, to my knowledge, the first time in Arizona we have indicted an entire militia group under the conspiracy to commit civil disorder statute.
In 2017, she was busted by the University of California for embezzling $170 million. But really, PR wasn't the primary concern here. This is part of a long, infractory pattern of pulverizing our civil rights, using a busted-in-half court system and executive overreach, and what they can't cover up, the talking heads and hacks in media giddily fucking will. The hilarity of it all is, we needed the Viper militia to prevent what happened to the Viper militia. The term militia, by the by, was coined by the media. While the Vipers once belonged to a greater group of organized militias, they never once actually described themselves as one, and no longer belonged to that group when they were apprehended by the ATF. Not even the Viper militia was technically a militia. Those were Janet Reno and Peter Jennings' words. Rot in peace, shitheads. And the false narrative somehow still fucking persists. A full decade and a half of countervailing evidence didn't stop Keith Olbermann from cowering behind his Clark Kent glasses to spin the story in 2009 and paint the militia as a murder factory in the Arizona desert during a hit piece against lapsed libertarian Ernst Hancock, in which he once again reported the long discredited 90 assault rifles seized statistic even the ATF now admits was fucking false, along with incorrectly stating the quantity and type of explosive material.
Mr. Hancock is also an online radio host and frequent defender of the Viper militia. In July 1996, federal agents arrested a dozen of the so-called Vipers, along with the 90 high-powered rifles they had, 500 pounds of the bomb-making compound ammonium nitrate fertilizer, blasting cord, blasting caps, gas masks, bulletproof vests, and uniforms with a Viper insignia. Asked about the Vipers, Mr. Hancock said, quote, "This militia scare is what got them. It was all manufactured. The entire case was made up. Just like Waco."
Look, whatever you define them as, this is how modernity treats a militia, unregulated or otherwise. Even non-military ad hoc organizations like the Minutemen, unarmed volunteers who did little more than man the Arizona border and report intrusions to authorities, were cast as anti-Mexican bigots at best and ticking terrorism time bombs at worst. They don't want this shit regulated. They don't want an armed populace, a militia, or frankly even a fucking military, provided their rifles aren't perpetually trained at their own constituents. And if we've learned anything in the last 3 years, it's that almost anything the existing political paradigm doesn't want is all but guaranteed to be precisely what we fucking need. And as for Beto, if the polls are any indication, his buybacks may be a bust, but at least we finally have an epilogue to Beavis and Butthead Do America. I'm Razor Fist. God fucking speed.
Trouble's coming, feast is over. The king has on the
I have 4 children. I'm 5'0", 100 pounds. Cannot really defend myself with a fist.
It's okay. Please let's allow her to finish.
I don't have my AR-15 today. I have my Glock. Well, you shouldn't have it. Don't worry, sir. I have your back.